All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self-acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories along with practical tools and actionable insights to help guide you along your healing journey. Together, we'll explore the hidden gifts, lessons, and blessings inside grief that can empower you to reclaim your life and create an inspiring future. I'm really excited today because our guest is somebody who never thought in a million years they would become a poet and an author. And this all happened out of the loss of her father. So I'm really excited for you guys to meet her. I want to introduce Anne Marie Wells. She's an award winning poet, playwright, memorist, and oral storyteller. She is the author of two collections of poetry, Survived by, a memoir in verse and other poems, published by Curious Corvid Publishing, and Mother Coma Verb, which is won the 2023 Cinnamon Press Chapbook Contest and was published in 2024. She also has a children's book, A Mommy, Why Am I a Bird, was published by University of Canberra Press and was featured on Wyoming's PBS Storytime with Wyoming Author Series. When she's not writing, you can find her spending time outdoors with her family, on her yoga mat, or eating any kind of cheese. And so, without further ado, I want to introduce Anne Marie Wells. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me.
And before we get started, I have to ask, because I think the audience is going to wonder this question too. What's your favorite cheese to eat?
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I could choose, but I would say the stinkier the better. Like some people are anti-stinky cheese. I want the stinkiest cheeses, like really robust flavor. Yeah. Blue cheeses, camembert is in the top, but I mean, really, I've yet to meet it. But I also love like the like not really cheese that comes in like a spray can. I have not met a cheese that I disliked.
I love that. And I'm grateful to say that on my podcast, you were the first cheese connoisseur that I have met. And I just think it's a wonderful thing because I've learned, I know there's a world of cheese out there. I've never explored it, but I will say I can get you there with the stinky cheese because I like Swiss cheese on a ham sandwich. I don't know why, but it tastes great.
Yeah, Swiss cheese. I also love cottage cheese. I love cream cheese, paneer in Indian food. I mean, really, I love it all. Yeah.
I love that. Well, I wanna get into your story because when we met a couple weeks ago, this was such an inspirational story, one that was full of unexpected twists and turns of what came out of losing your father. And so I want you to share that story with everybody because I got very wound into it because it was such an interesting transformation of who you became out of all this and to see the purpose and meaning you got behind losing your father was tremendously huge. So, without further ado, I'm going to give you the floor to share that story.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. It's always hard to know when to start or what background information is really needed. Before I call it the news that my father was diagnosed with stage 4 terminal lung cancer. Before any of that happened, I was living in Wyoming. I was trying for years to get my foot in the door in the ecology and environmental sciences world. I had a master's in ecology that wasn't being put to use. And I had just landed what I thought was my dream job as the executive director for a science education nonprofit. Maybe 2 months later, I got this this fire truck that just ran me over. That my father had less than a year to live, and I just knew immediately what I needed to do. I needed to pack everything up and uproot my life and move to Florida where my parents were living in order to help my mom care for him and to spend time with him before he passed. I did that. I found a subletter for my apartment and packed up essentials and took my German Shepherd mutt over cross country. And in that process, I was working remotely before it was cool. But this was before the pandemic, 2019. And I was working part-time or working full-time, but remotely. And then as my dad got progressively sicker, I went to half-time. And there was this moment in his illness when he couldn't get up. It was after his second round of chemo, and he was so weak. He was so dehydrated. He couldn't stand. And my mother and I made the decision to call the ambulance to come and get him. They rushed him to the emergency room, and it turned out that he had sepsis and pneumonia on top of his stage 4 lung cancer. He was so weak, he couldn't hold an ice chip in his mouth. He just seeing him in the hospital bed, struggling to even keep his mouth closed in order to suck on an ice chip. I thought for sure this was going to be the last day that he had, and it was only a couple months later. That night, my mother went home to be with the dogs, to feed them and take them out. I stayed with my dad in the hospital on this little vinyl sofa, laying down but not sleeping. I was afraid that if I did fall asleep, that he would pass in the middle of the night alone, not holding anybody's hand, or me not knowing somehow. And I just stayed awake as he was hooked up to all these machines and they were prepping him for a blood transfusion. And in the middle of the night, I was compelled to write a poem. People asked me what this was really my moment. This was my first poem. People asked me, what made you write a poem? Did you write poetry before? And the answer is no, I didn't write poetry before. I liked to write. I was mostly a blogger. I also had written some plays, but they were rom-com, very like comedic style plays. I was working on a travel memoir, but again, very wry, sarcastic type of humor, not what you would typically consider, poetry writing. I didn't read collections of poetry. I wasn't well versed in poetry, if you will, but I was compelled to write a poem. And I tell people a ghost told me to do it because I have no explanation as to why. And it wasn't just, oh, I think I'll write a poem. I had to write a poem. I I could not sleep. I could not think of anything else. I needed to write a poem right that instant. Though I didn't have a pen or any paper or anything, but I found a receipt in my bag and I borrowed a pen from the nurse's station and I wrote a poem about one of my favorite memories with my dad when I would go to visit them, my parents in Florida. My dad and I would always go to the beach together, just go for a long walk along the beach. And one time when we were walking back, we just kind of, meander to a certain distance, turn around and come back. And when we were on our way back, we suddenly saw a baby turtle scrambling in the sand toward the ocean. And then we saw another one and another one. And we followed this little trail of baby turtles to the nest where they were all emerging out of the sand. It was incredible because you didn't see a gaping hole or something that they were crawling out of. It was just flat sand. And then all of a sudden, a baby turtle was popping out of it. And one after the other, after the other, after the other, and all flopping around in their newly turtle bodies, trying to make their way to the ocean, and then eventually getting pulled out with the tide, sometimes being pulled back in by the tide, and then having to find their way back out. And we ended up staying well past the sun setting. And this was before smartphones or maybe it was like right at the beginning of smartphones that had flashlights on them and stuff, but I didn't have one. I wasn't hip to the new technology. I only had a Motorola flip phone, and we had to use the light of my flip phone in order to make our way back to the car because we stayed so late. My mother probably was worried about us at the time because we would have been home much sooner than that. And I wrote a poem about it. I wanted I wanted to make sure that that was documented in some special way. And I did bring it with me today, so I'll read it to you. I'll read it to you now. Holding the shell of the man he used to be to my ear, his tidal voice crashed ashore, calling me to watch a nest of turtles break free from their sandy womb, frantic to find their ocean mother, a race from first breath to moonlit waves. I will remember you this way, I promise.
That was really powerful. That's and I wanted to clarify too for the listeners because you shared this part of things too. That first poem you wrote was on a receipt in the hospital, right?
Yes, and people have also asked me, "Do you have the receipt?" And I don't. I have no idea what happened to it. And my only thought was that I had no idea that was going to be the first domino in a series of dominoes leading me to where I am today. So my only thought is that eventually I typed it into my computer and I just threw it away, thinking like, oh, I don't need this anymore. It's in my computer. I had no idea also at the time that suddenly my entire life would um, revolve around poetry. It may have been a defense mechanism now looking back in hindsight, or not so much a coping mechanism, not a defense mechanism, but a coping mechanism. Um, After that moment, after my dad was in the hospital with sepsis and pneumonia, he did go back home. He lived through the night and he stayed in the hospital a few more days after that, maybe close to a week after that. And um, I then went to half-time, working half-time for work, and then eventually quarter time. And when my dad was referred to hospice a couple weeks later, I just resigned from my what I thought was my dream job. It turned out that I didn't care about science education when my father was dying. And all I wanted to do was spend time with him and write poems about it. I had some insights into the literary world because of my artsy friends and my work with playwriting and working on my travel memoir. And so I had been around poets, though none of them were like my close friends at the time, but I knew of submitting work to literary journals, curating collections, publishing books, publishing collections, traditional publishing versus self-publishing. I had an idea of those steps. And so when I had a handful of poems, I decided to send them out to literary journals just to see what happened because they didn't cost any money. I wasn't submitting to anything that had a reader fee or anything like that, but just to see. And within a couple of weeks, I got yeses that yes, we want to publish your poem. I was flabbergasted. I was flabbergasted that anybody would want to publish my poetry, but it gave me the encouragement and validation I needed to keep going, that what I was writing was important. And I had the honor of telling my dad that 5 of my poems were published or accepted for publication before he passed away. They weren't yet published, but they had been accepted for publication. And even now, it was just something that I was sharing with him, but had no idea that it was going to become my life. After I resigned from my job, all I was doing was sitting in hospice with him, writing poems on my computer or in my little journal, documenting this journey. I was also blogging about it, but documenting this journey of his illness, caring for him at the end of his life, eventually his passing, and then my subsequent grief journey. I did return to Wyoming, and almost immediately the entire world shut down with the pandemic. And I got a job that was just an entry level caregiving job for adults with disabilities. And that provided me the flexibility to be able to go back to school. Everything was online now. So the school that it was in Cheyenne, now was available to me on the complete opposite side of the state in Jackson. So I was able to go back to school part-time and complete my degree in English and learn more about writing, learn more about poetry. And I took every workshop that I could find online. Everything went online suddenly. So all of these opportunities that wouldn't have been available to me in rural Wyoming suddenly were. I was taking courses with instructors who were living in New York and in Seattle and in Los Angeles and Chicago, just all of these different places that wouldn't have been places that I could have had access to otherwise. And because of that, I think I was able to learn very quickly. I also had a lot of opportunities to practice and do free writing and writing prompts and build up my collection. In the meantime, writing about all of my sad feelings and my grief about my father passing was so healing for me. I didn't have to hold it in. I didn't have to keep it to myself to make other people more comfortable. And even though oftentimes when I was in poetry workshops and we would be reading our poetry out loud, and most people's poems are like, oh, I'm so in love with my partner, or oh, I was walking bare feet through the grass, listening to the birds singing. And then my poems were like, I'm so sad that my dad died. Everybody was so supportive and willing to listen to my sad poems, and them bearing witness to me and my experience and listening to it through poetry also was so healing for me as well. It ended up completely changing my life. Eventually, I put all of those poems into my book, Survived by a Memoir in Verse and Other Poems. I used my blog posts as a foundation. I turned those blog posts into poetry that make up the majority of this book, along with the other poems like the turtle poem that I read for you. And when it was published in 2023, my dad had passed 3 years earlier. I went on a book tour. I was reading my book to audiences across the United States in person and virtually. But I was also facilitating a writing workshop that I call Synonyms for Grief, which is the name of a poem written by K.E. Ogden. Actually, that was about her father passing away. And using that poem and other poems about grief, not just mine, but other poets' poetry about grief, I created a workshop that was more of a means for people who aren't writers necessarily. They could be writers. They might never have written a poem or anything in their life. It's for anybody to have a writing prompt. What are your synonyms for grief? What is it that you need to say? What is on your heart? And I have these different exercises and different writing prompts that allow people to express it. And then also knowing that they're in community with other grievers who are there for the same reason, they have more of a safe space to share their poetry with people who are willing to receive it, rather than sharing a poem about how sad they are and potentially making someone feel uncomfortable, or them feeling awkward and uncomfortable, sharing something intimate, personal, vulnerable to the wrong person. And and that has been healing for me too, being able to share my writing exercises that helped me with others, and then also hear that those exercises help them as well. So I think that's it in a nutshell. I mean, that's a really long story, but my grief really took me from where I thought I wanted to be when I landed that what I thought was my dream job. I was on cloud nine. I didn't think life could get any better. And then the universe was just like, "Oh, you thought that's what you wanted? Let me just clarify things for you here." And my life has taken a completely different trajectory than I ever thought that it would. I never thought I would be called a poet, let alone an award-winning one or a published one or one with not one but two collections of poetry. What? Just even saying it out loud seems like impossible. Wait, that's me? No, 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 not possible.
I think you're such a true testament to the grief journey and what that brings for people. I Something I brought up a lot on podcast episodes lately is that grief is a personal transformation journey, and that we have the version of us that exists before we go through grief, loss, and trauma. We have this total new person that we experience and get to meet after we go through that and as we start to heal. And
Mm,
I love your story. This is why I was so thankful that you were on my podcast today, because hearing how you were going to lose the one person in your life, your father, you cared a lot about, and you had life go in this direction, and all of a sudden life yanked you over here. And
mhm.
what you thought was going to be life turned into something completely different. And I just
Yeah.
love how you shared just now. You said like, I'm an award-winning poet. Like it just kind of hits you all of a sudden that like, how did this happen? And how did I even
Yeah.
get here? And I think that's the beauty of grief, is that through those waves of grief, you said a lot in your story. There's so much I wanted to hit on, but I'll just say that
Yeah.
through those waves of grief, you found purpose and meaning through them. And just that,
Hmm.
I loved it when I first heard that story. And you said, I don't know what inspired me, but I went down to the nursing station to find a pen because I couldn't find a pen. And then I had nothing to write on. So I
Hmm.
found a receipt. And I was sitting there in my head going, a receipt? Like what? Like, where is this going? Like, and then that led you to following turtles at the beach. And I was going, now I'm intrigued, really intrigued where this is going,
Hmm.
because I didn't feel like you were like had intention for any of this. It all just was happening. Like you were just listening to the universe say, follow this path. And you were like, I'm gonna follow this, see where it goes.
I had
And
nothing to lose. I was already at rock bottom. I had nothing to lose. Even if I wrote the crappiest poem that ever existed, I needed to write it. I had to. All of the poems that I wrote after that, it wasn't just I wanted to do it. I had to. I had to.
yeah, I think that's what's so powerful about your journey, is that you didn't just do this on a whim. You didn't just do this because something wasn't working, or trying something out of the box because other things in life weren't lining up. Like you literally followed your calling in the universe. And on
Hmm.
top of all those great accomplishments you have, which I mean, I'll celebrate you to the moon on that, but the big one that you just talked about was the fact that you gave people writing prompts to work through their own grief journeys. And I think that's so powerful in so many ways. I don't know a lot about poetry myself, so I stand corrected if you want to correct me at all in this episode. But I think it's such a unique modality that a lot of people don't think about or consider or see as an option. And I do think that poetry, from the little I've heard from talking to you, I think it's a great outlet for especially grief, because I don't feel like
Yeah.
grief is this thing where we can linearly say that, oh, I feel this and this is my path, and we can line things out. And I think poetry gives the freedom for you to express that grief in the shape and form in which it comes to you, and that there is no
Hmm.
structure to that, if you will. And that's what's interesting about grief doesn't really have structure. It's like a big monstrous ocean. But poetry gives space for that to be exactly what it is,
Hmm.
and for you to give writing prompts to people, and the number of people you're helping through grief journeys that you didn't have yourself when you went through it. I think that's the ultimate gift. I mean, that's cool. You're an author. I love that about you, but I am inspired by the fact that this thing led you to helping so many people through their grief journeys.
Yes, and what you said just reminded me of a quote from Toni Morrison. She said something along the line, an author, Pulitzer Prize or maybe Nobel laureate. She was immaculate. She said something along the lines of, if you need to read a book and it hasn't been written, then you need to write that book. And after I had written Survive By, I write it as um, kind of a guide. I write in the first line, where is the how-to guide for tragedy, the textbook for grief 101? And there isn't one. And I needed to write it for myself. And I wrote it as I was experiencing it. What were the steps to grief for me? Because they weren't just denial, anger, sadness, bargaining, acceptance, or whatever order that they come in. They what I was experiencing, I needed more than just what emotions you're going to experience. I needed, tell me what to do. Tell me how to handle this. What are the steps I need to take in order to cope with this? And I wrote it myself. I didn't have this book, and I had to write it for me as well. And after my publisher had accepted it and we signed a book deal, I then did another revision of it. So once you think you're done, you're still not done. You still go through another round of revisions. And in my last round of revision, knowing that this is it, this is what's going to the printer, I just started weeping. Like, I love this book so much. It's not just a testament to how wonderful my dad was and how much he impacted my life, still impacts my life. It was the book that I needed to read. And when I read about the past version of myself that didn't have this support and who didn't have um I don't know what to say, these verses to read, I feel bad for her. I want to give her a big hug and say, it's okay, you're going to write it yourself and you're going to help so many other people. But I just wept as I read it because I said, I needed this book. I needed it. And I hope that it's the book that other people need as well. And then now they have it. Now it exists.
That's such a powerful thing that you said because I'm working on writing my own book this year. It's a goal I have because
Oh,
it's
awesome.
but it's the same reason you just said that when I went through grief, losing my son, when I went through losing my grandfather, there wasn't a book out there about how to do grief. I mean, I kind of like the
Mm-hmm.
same thing. There's no book out there that says, here's how to be a parent. That doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right.
and so I love that you took that aspect with poetry because I really think that as much as grief is an individual journey, there's a lot to be learned from other people's grief journeys. And it's
Mm-hmm.
why I created this podcast, by the way, because I said, I want to make a legacy for my son, but number one, how can I do that in a way that's going to impact other people? And I thought about this collaborative
Yeah.
collection of grief stories and people like you that
Yeah.
have gone through a major loss, something that really hits you deep. And there wasn't, like you just said about your book, you said that I looked for one, there wasn't one. And so I wrote one.
Mm-hmm.
And I did this so
Yeah.
that other people can now say, I've got a tool, I've got a resource, I've got something I can go to lean on as I go through grief. And I
Right.
think there's just so much power in that because I've talked to so many people about their grief journeys, and while we all experience some similar things of emotion, how we process it, how we handle it, what we make of it, what we do with it is so different. And
Oh, absolutely.
it's just the beauty of that process. And
Mm-hmm.
I really commend people for how they go through grief because there's always something we can learn from everyone's grief journey that can make life just
I
a little bit
agree.
easier for us.
I agree. And like you said, I think making grief easier or trying to, grief is never easy. Trying to help others, I think is where grievers come full circle. When they're at a place where I describe it in my book as when you're going through a construction zone and there's that truck that guides the path for other cars through the construction zone until you get to the other side and then they turn around and come back and do it for the other side, that at first you're the car being led if you have a guiding truck. But then later, as you heal or as you become more healed and you find your purpose, you find your meaning in your grief. You become the guide truck leading the other cars through the construction zone. You are doing it with your podcast and facilitating all of these different grief stories so that other grievers who are listening can feel seen, can feel heard, can feel validated, can say, that's how I feel too. And I'm doing the same thing with poetry, but there are other people who are doing it through, I don't know, fitness, or they're doing it through recovery, or they're doing it through um, knitting. My mom knits constantly, and one of the things that she does is she makes lap robes for the patients in the same facility that my dad was in. And so she makes like little lap blankets for them. And that's the way that she gives back and helps others. And I think that's just a symbol of coming full circle. In my book, I also describe in my former relationship, not the one that I'm currently in, forever partnered now, but in my previous relationship, um, I was crying to him saying, I don't deserve you being here. Why are you here helping me? And I'm like such a mess. Like, why are you standing by me? Type of thing. And this was like in the middle of the night. I'm like weeping. He's like, what? What's going on? And his response now just seems so, and I'm literally just realizing now, seems so appropriate. He said, I didn't have anybody to be there for me when my brother died, and it makes me feel good to be here for you now. That is just the essential, like full circle. Like when you get to the other side, you help and you want to help other people. It's like you want to heal your own wound. I didn't have anybody. I didn't have anybody telling me what to do or how to go through this. I needed this guide. And now I'm going to be that person for somebody else. And we all do it in our different ways. We all do it in our different ways.
I think that's what's beautiful about ourselves because yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So it's a topic that I discuss on my podcast pretty frequently is that had I not lost my son, I wouldn't be able to help people in that community that have lost a child. I mean, I can relate to them. I can say, I get it. I understand it. Had I
Yeah.
not had that experience, I couldn't help those people. You
Mm-hmm.
losing your father, you can relate to people lose a parent real easy. I
Yeah.
haven't walked that road yet personally, but you've walked it, you've experienced it, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's the beauty of grief that I've come to find over what I've gone through is that when we all go through grief, we now are given this gift, and that gift is exactly what you said, coming full circle to be able to help other people go through it. And that's not to say that it's going to make it easier and you're going to get over it faster. It's not to say any of those things, but it's to say that there's somebody there that understands where you're at and they've walked that
Mm-hmm.
path before you have. And so you
Yeah.
don't have to be alone. You don't have to be
Right.
isolated. You
Exactly. You don't
can,
have to, you have to go through it one way or the other. Like, why not have a friend going
yeah,
through it?
it's like I watch Bob Ross painting all the time because he's kind of my like calming nighttime activity to paint. And something he always talks about when he paints trees in particular, he always says everybody needs a friend. And so he paints, two trees or three trees. He never paints a lone tree. And so I
Oh.
always talk about that in grief that
Mm-hmm.
I went through it alone when I lost my child, and that was hard. I was depressed for a long
Mm-hmm.
time, year and a half, and is a very, very dark place. And I wish I
Mm-hmm.
had more lost parents around me that were like, hey, I get it. I've been there and it sucks. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just somebody to say those kind of things really helps you kind of go, okay, I don't feel so alone right now. I can walk through this.
Yeah.
And that's what I love
Instead of
about,
feeling like, oh, you need to get over this, or like, hasn't it been a year? Like, and you're still feeling this way, or making you feel invalidated. I told you before when we were talking a couple weeks ago, one of the things I hate when people say is, it's going to be okay. No, it's not.
nope.
It's never going to be okay. Don't tell me it's going to be okay, especially if you've never walked this road before. If you've never lost somebody that you love, don't tell me that it's going to be okay. It's never going to be okay.
I think that's the hardest thing in the grief space. I was talking to a lady that's she's a grief coach, and she brought up a huge topic about inappropriate things people say during to grievers.
Oh,
And one of the biggest things I
mm,
loved about talking to her, she said, grievers don't want to be fixed. We don't want that. Like
mm,
we know how to do that. We'll get there. But we want to feel seen and we want to feel heard and we want to feel understood. And when we
mhm,
have that space where people give that to us, that's actually what helps us heal. And that's what I
mhm,
really love about that you brought up that you have writing prompts for people. And me as somebody that doesn't know anything about poetry, I tried to write poetry back in school and teachers didn't like my thing, so I kind of gave up on it. But I'll just say that even if I don't know it or even if I didn't like it, let's just say I chose to say I'm gonna go do this. You giving those prompts and giving that space is exactly what's needed for somebody. And you could be the worst poet, probably me right here because I can't write very well. But I'll just say that I could be the worst writer and go to a class like that where you give writing prompts, and I would not put any doubt that I would be able to sit there and all those thoughts would be able to come out. They would just be able to go right down on
mhm.
paper whatever way they came
And that's the
out.
point. Yeah, the point is
Yeah,
not to create world's best poem right now. That's the product is not important. The process is important. It's only a vehicle to get out what you're holding inside outside of you. And one of
exactly.
my favorite quotes is from Sappho, a famous poet from, centuries ago, millennia ago, said, "What cannot be said will be wept." And I think that that's really powerful that if you can't get it out of you, it's going to come out one way or the other. And better for it to come out in a positive outlet, in a controlled outlet, and um, in an outlet that might create beauty in the world versus when other people hold it in and maybe it ends up coming out in a volcanic eruption of anger or displacement against somebody else that you're angry about your loss, but you're taking it out on your partner or your kid or your coworker or something instead because you haven't dealt with the feelings that you're feeling. Or it might come out internally through um, illness and maybe migraines or high blood pressure or any slew of psychosomatic symptoms that humans experience when they're not allowing themselves to feel their feelings.
Yeah, I mean, when my grandfather passed, he died in my arms one night. It was a very tragic thing. One experience I don't wish on people. I know it happens, but it's very traumatic. I'll say that. And I remember jumping on my phone that night because I didn't have pen and paper. I wish I had a receipt. That would have been nice. But I jumped on my phone and I wrote like I was talking to him, and I remember so much anger. I can't, write. I can't talk about it, so I'll cry, but. I just had a lot of anger come out of me a lot, and I just didn't understand,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't want it to happen. I wasn't ready for it, and I
Of
had
course
not.
not. We never are.
We never are, but it's, and then, the interesting thing is when my son passed, the same thing. I chose to cremate him because I didn't want him to be in a cemetery. And so anyway, I remember before that all happened, I told my wife, I said, we need to write a letter to him. And I said it needs to be
Mm-hmm.
from the heart. And so I
Mm-hmm.
when I went through that process, when I was writing a letter for him, it was very releasing, but I didn't have so much sadness and so I didn't have all these things I thought I was going to feel. And I think that's what's interesting about writing is sometimes you think you're going to write one way, but when it comes out on paper, it's totally different. And I ended up writing a
Mm-hmm.
very loving, very kind note and very like from the heart. It just came out of me and I didn't see that. I didn't envision that or see it. But when it came out through writing, I was like, wow, that's my heart on paper. It
Yeah.
was a very surreal experience. I was going to ask
Mm-hmm.
you, since you're a poet and I know nothing about this, what's it like doing poetry and having those feelings and emotions come out? Do you sometimes start a poem in one space of mind and it transmutes into something else when you finish writing it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Poems often, when I'm writing them, I have an idea of what they're going to be, and then they say, nope, I'm going to be this other thing. And I don't know how that happens. You know, something in the subconscious brain is maybe allowed to come forward and take over the conscious brain. It really feels sometimes like my hand has its own mind, like how octopuses, their tentacles have their own like nervous systems or something. And so sometimes tentacles are doing one thing and the octopus is like redirecting their own tentacles to do something else because they're not like doing the right thing. I feel like that with my hand sometimes as I'm writing, that it just has its own mind and it's writing what it wants to write. And I don't have as much control of it as I think that I do. And often I say to myself, I want to write a poem about X. So in the case of my turtle poem, it was just I want to write a poem about that moment. That's my intention. That's only my intention, and that's what happened. Or I wrote another poem in my book about how my dad used to be a caretaker for his parents' cemetery because
Hmm.
it didn't have a caretaker and it was completely overrun and you could barely find the gravestones in it. And so he took it upon himself to be the caretaker. First, just bringing his push lawnmower, but you can imagine it's a cemetery. It's not a huge one, but it's, you know, the size of a football field. And then he ended up buying a driving lawnmower with his own money just to take care of the cemetery. And he would clean off graves that, you know, he doesn't even know these people, but he would clean them off of all the lichen and the moss that was growing on them. He would plant flowers at graves that didn't have any. And his parents' graves were just so well taken care of. I even went there years later, a few years later. I just happened to be in my hometown in upstate New York and just went to go see. And it still was so lovely because he had flowers that were like reblooming, that would rebloom every year. And the plants that were on there still look so nice compared to a lot of the other ones. But I was pleased to see that the graveyard was then being taken care of and somebody had mowed, even though it wasn't my dad. Um, so I wrote a poem about how my dad used to do that. And now when I go to visit his grave, I buy flowers and I lay one on his grave, but then I lay them on the ones around him who don't have any flowers. And and so I just wanted to write a poem about that instance. I'm gonna find it because then my poem ended up turning into a little bit different. Like it had its own mind. And at the end of the poem, I'm just gonna read the end of it to you. I carry his funeral flowers like a baby in my arms, lay one at a time across barren graves near his. And maybe visiting strangers will be touched to see a lily, even desiccated from the sun, atop their loved one's grave. Maybe this was my father's sentiment too. Maybe he thought not of those who passed on, but of those who would pass by. They would know someone cared enough. Or maybe they would think it was their ancestors' way of saying hi from the other side. And maybe when you think about it, it was.
Wow, that was beautiful. Just
I just didn't even know that that's where the poem was going to go, that it was going to have this reflection about my father's intentions or um, staying connected to ancestors in this way. I had no idea that's where it was going to go. All I wanted to write about was how my father would do this thing and how now I want to do it too in his honor. So, yeah, oftentimes I sit down to write anything and it turns into something I had no idea it was going to be. Yeah.
so now when you write your poems, do you I'm trying to find the right way to phrase this, but do you have like all the words figured out in your head, or do you just start writing and they just naturally come? I'm just
No,
curious.
absolutely not. Yeah, no, and all of these poems, they went through revision and rewriting, of course.
Hmm.
So even the turtle poem, I don't think that that was the original. version of it. It has little tweaks here and there, little word changes here and there, changes to the line breaks, or maybe there's a section I take out completely. Oh, this doesn't really fit in here. The first version of a poem is never the last version of it, even if it's just tiny little tweaks. The writing really happens in the rewriting. The first draft of something is what, like, the skeleton of the poem. And then um, as new versions get created, it becomes more fully fleshed out. And then suddenly you have what it's supposed to be in the end. But it takes time. And sometimes I write a poem. I have this document on my computer. I throw it in my poem incubator, I call it. And I don't even look at it for weeks, maybe. And all of these poems, they were published in 2023. I started writing them in 2020. So they had
Oh, wow.
a lot of time. And then also during that time, I learned new skills in writing. I learned new skills in poetry. I got new ideas as well. And I put those new skills to work in my old poems so that they, um, I don't know, packed more of a punch, or they felt more authentic to what I really wanted to say. And the end result is what you see, but you don't see all of the behind the scenes part of the writing and rewriting and bringing those poems to workshop and having other people read them and provide suggestions or share their opinions on them. And yeah, it's it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time.
You just gave me a really big realization about grief while you were talking about that.
Yes,
And
sure.
as you talked about writing this poem, I was sitting there thinking about this when you said, what you're seeing is the final version of this thing, and it's not even final at that point. It can still change, but this is the original
Absolutely.
was way back here. And I was thinking about grief as time goes on, that we have really
Hmm.
strong, intense emotions up front, and it slowly kind of starts getting a little easier, then it rears its head again, then it gets a little easier.
Oh yeah.
And so grief, like writing, is very fluid and very ups and down. It changes all the time. It becomes something different as we go through those processes. And I think that it's
Hmm.
it's so fitting. So I'm grateful for this breakthrough you just gave today on this podcast.
Yeah.
That grief and writing are very similar paths. That they're not always done. They're not always final. There's always something that can be changed or modified depending on like you said, you wrote an initial copy of a poem, but then you learn new skills, you learn new writing patterns, and
Hmm.
that poem that you first had in first edition, maybe the third edition of it, all of that new change is implemented into it. And I noticed when you
Yeah.
read that last poem, just it was short, but there was so much detail in that. There was so much impact in it for such few words, and it was almost like describing an entire movie in one paragraph. And so
Oh, thank you.
I just think that's very powerful to be able to have that skill and write in that capacity.
Thank you. And what you were just saying, I think we're having a breakthrough together. It reminded me of a story I heard about a poet named Galway Kinnell. He won like the Pulitzer Prize in literature or poetry or something back in 1980s. And I'm not sure where I heard this story, so I hope that I don't mess it up too bad, but he was about to do a reading of his collection that just won the Pulitzer Prize. So this collection was already renowned, and people were saying this collection is it for, whatever year in 1986 or something like that. But in the green room, before he was about to go on, he was making edits to his own collection in his own book with a pencil. And someone, maybe it was the person who was going to like usher him out or introduce him, and they said, "Your book just won the Pulitzer Prize. You're editing your poems." And his response was, "This is what they feel like to me today." And I just think that just like that, that is also how grief is. This is how it feels like to me today. I still weep for my father. I I have days where I don't cry at all. I have days when I cry a lot. It's been over 5 years now. And today, grief feels inspiring. I feel in community with you. Other times, grief feels very lonely. February is a particularly hard month because my father was both born and died in February. He died 5 days before his birthday, and he would have turned 80 this year. So it's like a milestone
Mm.
birthday. I also have a particularly hard time when he comes to me in dreams. And sometimes in my dreams, I know that he's dead. And in my dream, it feels so special. Like, oh, I get this moment. Thank you so much for visiting. And then other times in my dream, he's not dead. In my dream, he's still alive. And and I wake up sometimes thinking like, oh, that felt so good. That felt so good to feel that he was alive and to feel just the ignorance that he ever died. And other times I wake up and I'm weeping. I woke up sometime last year, my partner woke me up because he could tell I was in distress. And I was weeping in my dream because I knew that he was dead, but he came to me. So it's just, these different moments that grief can feel different every single day. Or you can tell one story about your lost loved one and be okay or even feel happy, feel bittersweet. And then the next time you share that exact same story, you're weeping like a baby. It there's no there's no one way. And just like in poetry or writing, that it's constantly evolving and constantly changing, so is grief, I think, just like you were saying.
Yeah, grief is it's such an array of experiences. Like you said, after I lost my son, I never really understood this, but every 23rd of the month, 'cause he was born September 23rd, every 23rd of the month, I was angry that day. I'd wake up out of bed angry, and didn't have
Yeah.
intention for it. It just happened, and
Hmm.
it took me a good
Yeah.
3 months to figure it out. But I like kind of tied that together and said, "You're not angry. You're very, very sad right now, and that anger is
That's
because
right.
he's not here, and you got to listen to that
That's right.
stuff, and you got to be kind with yourself. You got to give yourself grace. You got to give yourself permission to feel." And I think
Hmm.
that's something that I really love that you give people writing prompts for, because that's exactly what it is giving people permission to say, this is what grief is today for me. This is how I feel,
Hmm.
and that's okay. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. And I think that that's
Hmm.
something that I'm my mission on the grief space is exactly that. Just as we do it in writing prompts, I do it through coaching. Just that,
Yeah.
give yourself space, give yourself permission. It's okay. I think a lot of
Hmm.
people that go through grief, because society conditions us this way, is to say, after your 5 day bereavement, life moves on. Got to get over it. And
I
I just
know. I know.
I struggle with that so much because I see it in people's faces. I see it in their body language, and I just go, you're hurting inside. And I'm going to be the one guy that
Yeah.
steps in your path that says, I want you to be here right now. Forget the rest of that stuff.
Hmm.
Be right with it, because
Hmm.
you owe it to yourself to be there. You owe it to yourself to listen to how you feel, listen to your grief.
Hmm.
I've always said emotions are messengers. Emotions aren't
Oh,
things to
yeah.
control. They're things to listen to.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
if you don't listen to your grief, it'll come out in nasty ways. I've talked to people that have gotten DUIs, mishandling their grief. I've talked to people that have
Hmm.
gotten into addictions, gotten into life situations that weren't good. And I said
Hmm.
those things are just symptoms because you didn't listen to grief and didn't give
Yep.
yourself permission and space to heal. And that's
Hmm.
I coined a phrase a couple weeks ago. When you start to feel, you start to heal. That's really where it takes place.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Yeah. There's no way around it other than through. You have to go through it. You can't, there's no going over it. There's no going under it. There's no going around it. You have to go through it. And you're going to go
I'm
through it one way or the other. Like if it's going to be right now, or if it's going to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now, suddenly you're going to be facing those kinds of situations, and then it'll dawn on you, oh, I'm really sad that I lost this person, and that's why I'm here.
Well, I think it's just been so good to have you on this podcast. You've certainly given me a lot to think about. I'll tell you that. I'll be rewatching this episode soon. And what I wanted to do as we wrap up here, I ask every guest this because you've got an incredible story, like a lot of people, and I love that you celebrate your father with what you do every day. I just love that about you. If you
Thank
could
you.
talk to somebody today that is just starting that grief journey that might have lost
Mm.
a family member, lost somebody close to them, what would be one or two things you would tell them in that grief process that would help kind of guide them or navigate them as they start that journey?
Yeah, I would say surround yourself with other grievers. When I was going through it, all I wanted to do was hear about other people's hurt. Please tell me about your pain. And not just because I don't know, I wanted to hear that somebody else was suffering, but I wanted to maybe forget about my own for a second and really understand that other people were suffering at the same time. At the same time, people who hadn't experienced loss really couldn't help me. They were saying things like, it'll be okay. And they don't know what it's like. They don't know what that loss is. And they mean well, but they're often not helpful. The people who are more helpful, I found, are the people who were experiencing it themselves. So, listening to podcasts like this, or finding a bereavement group, or even if it's just a friend or an acquaintance who also lost a loved one similar to yours, a person who lost a child, or a person who lost a parent, a person who lost a sibling, maybe a even more specific, a person who lost a loved one to suicide or to a car crash, or whatever it is, to cancer, that being around people who have experienced similar situations is just so helpful, that that's what I would recommend. And it was very helpful for me to be around people and to hear about their lost journeys, and to also hear about their healing journeys too. That seeing that there is light on the other side is helpful. Yeah.
I I think that's wonderful advice. I've been saying lately that people can empathize in life to the level of their experiences they've had. And so I share this because as somebody that didn't understand that, by the way, not even 3 years ago, I didn't understand this, that I was always looking for support from anybody around me. And I never realized that if I'm gonna go try to talk to somebody about losing my child with somebody that's never experienced that, they will feel they can sympathize with me, but they're never really gonna understand it. And
Right.
I had to learn that, if I'm looking for that, I've got to go find the lost parent community. I've got to go find people that have lost kids because they're gonna get it, they're gonna understand it, and it's gonna be a situation that moves me forward in my grief. Whereas people, if I open up to the wrong person, I'm gonna get re-traumatized in a sense, and it's
Exactly.
almost like
Exactly.
setting yourself
100%.
back. So being mindful
Yeah.
about who you reach out for help to is a big step in grief, and to know that you can control that, you can decide who you open up to, who you don't feel safe around. Making those powerful decisions for you in your healing process is huge. So I appreciate you sharing
Absolutely.
that. Um, and then, Anne-Marie, I want to ask you the better question here. How can we get a hold
Okay.
of you on where you at? Social media, your website, and also tell
Yeah.
us about these books that you wrote because you showed them today. Where can we find those?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for asking. I do have a website, annemariewellswriter.com, and I can be found everywhere online as Anne Marie Wells Writer, on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and I have a Substack as well, and just Anne Marie Wells, but you would be able to find it on my website as well. My books are available on Amazon as well as the publishers, so Curious Corvid Publishing. If you do buy my collection through them, you get some cool swag in addition to the book, and you get really cool packaging, and it's really nice. And then Mother, comma Verb is available through Cinnamon Press on their website or on Amazon as well.
That's awesome. Well, I just want to say, as we wrap up here, I want to thank you for all your time coming on my podcast and being vulnerable enough to share your story about losing your father, and also your incredible healing journey, and where this unexpected story that started with a receipt and a pen in the nursing station to the turtles at the sea, all the way to becoming an author and helping people with writing prompts through poetry explore their own grief journeys. You're an incredible person, and you're an inspiration to all of us who are either starting grief, going through grief right now, or even in our healing process and looking for a new outlet and a new perspective to process our grief. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm very grateful to be here.
Well, I want to let everybody know today. Thank you for joining us on the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. I just want to let you guys know this podcast, again, is about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. If this episode resonated with you, I'd like to invite you to subscribe by visiting my website at empoweredgriefjourney.com. You guys can also follow me on Facebook and YouTube. But more importantly, please share this episode with somebody who may need it. You're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself, take your grief journey one step at a time.